In June 1967, Israeli armored columns swept through the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights in just 6 days, seizing territory several times the size of Israel itself and shattering the combined militaries of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria in a campaign that became a byword for decisive armored victory. Barely 6 years later, that same confidence collapsed in the opening days of October 1973, when a coordinated Egyptian and Syrian surprise attack caught Israeli forces unprepared and destroyed close to 300 Israeli tanks within the war's first 72 hours, many of their crews killed instantly by ammunition fires inside vehicles never designed with crew survival as a primary engineering goal. It was directly out of that catastrophe that Israel's Merkava tank program was born, driven by a design philosophy so unusual for a main battle tank that its very name, meaning chariot in Hebrew, would come to stand for an entirely different way of thinking about what a tank was actually for. This episode traces how Israeli engineers built the Merkava around the radical premise that a crew's survival mattered more than any other single design consideration, and why a rear escape hatch, an almost embarrassingly simple feature by international tank design standards, would go on to save more lives during the Merkava Mk.4's most demanding combat test than any single inch of its armor. That premise, treating crew survival as the design's organizing principle rather than a secondary consideration layered on after firepower and mobility had already been decided, put Israeli engineers on a genuinely different path than virtually every other tank-producing nation in the world. Israel's armored forces before the Merkava program relied entirely on foreign-designed tanks, either purchased outright or substantially rebuilt from surplus stock, since the young state possessed neither the industrial base nor the political relationships to develop an indigenous tank design in its earliest decades. The Chariot, an Israeli-modified version of the British Centurion, fitted with an American diesel engine and upgraded fire control, formed the backbone of Israeli armor through the 1960s and into the 1973 war, while the Magach, Israel's designation for American M48 and M60 Patton tanks, filled out the remainder of the tank fleet. Both vehicles performed adequately against contemporary Arab armor, but neither had been designed with any particular attention to crew survivability beyond whatever baseline protection their original American or British designers had built in for entirely different strategic contexts. General Israel Tal, who had commanded Israeli armor during the 1967 war and become the country's most influential tank doctrine architect afterward, argued forcefully in the years following the 1973 disaster that Israel's specific strategic situation, a small population that could not sustain the casualty rates larger nations might absorb, demanded a fundamentally different design philosophy. A tank built explicitly around maximizing crew survival, even at the cost of other performance characteristics that most other nations' tank designers treated as more important. A young engineer who joined the nascent Merkava design team in the mid-1970s recalled Tal's guiding instruction plainly. He told us that every other army built tanks to win battles, and we needed to build a tank that would still bring its crew home, even in a battle that was already lost. Tal's argument extended beyond pure engineering into a broader point about Israeli society itself, one he reportedly made directly to skeptical military planners accustomed to prioritizing firepower and mobility above all else. A nation as small as Israel, drawing its tank crews from a limited pool of citizens who would otherwise return to civilian life and rebuild the country's economy, could not treat soldiers as an expendable resource the way larger nations with deeper manpower reserves sometimes implicitly did in their own equipment design choices. That philosophy manifested most visibly in an engineering choice unlike anything on a Western or Soviet tank of the era, placing the engine at the front of the hull rather than the rear, using the engine block itself as an additional layer of protection between the crew compartment and any incoming round from the front, while the rear of the vehicle, traditionally the most vulnerable and least protected section of most tank designs, became the crew's primary means of both entering and escaping the vehicle. That doctrinal choice sat inside a much larger and more consequential set of institutional failures exposed by the 1973 war itself. Israeli military intelligence in the years before the war had settled into what became known internally, with considerable bitterness afterward, as the concept, a set of assumptions holding that Egypt would not attack until it possessed the air power to neutralize Israeli air superiority, and that Syria would not attack without Egypt. Assumptions that led Israeli commanders to dismiss mounting evidence of an imminent coordinated assault right up until the attack began on 6 October 1973. Egypt and Syria, backed by substantial Soviet military aid and equipped with modern Soviet-supplied Saga anti-tank guided missiles in numbers, Israeli planners had significantly underestimated, exploited that complacency devastatingly in the war's opening days, with Egyptian infantry crossing the Suez Canal and destroying Israeli armor in the Sinai, using shoulder-fired and vehicle-mounted missiles that Israeli tank crews, trained primarily to expect conventional gun duels, were poorly prepared to counter. Israeli commanders sacked in the aftermath, and an official government commission of inquiry convened specifically to examine the intelligence and command failures that had allowed the surprise attack to succeed, concluded that overconfidence following the decisive 1967 victory had directly contributed to the institutional blindness that nearly resulted in Israel's defeat 6 years later. That commission's findings, later known as the Agranat Commission Report, forced the resignation of senior military and political figures and produced a broader cultural reckoning within the Israeli defense establishment about the dangers of assuming past victories guaranteed future ones, a lesson that extended well beyond tank design into intelligence assessment, training doctrine, and strategic planning across every branch of the armed forces. It was these same tank crews, riding in Shot and Magach vehicles, never designed to survive a penetrating hit, whose catastrophic losses in the war's opening days provided the concrete, undeniable justification for the entirely new design philosophy Tal and his engineering team had already begun quietly advocating before the war even began. The lineage that produced that new philosophy's first embodiment began with the Merkava Mk.4, which entered Israeli service in 1979 after nearly a decade of development. It carried a crew of 4, a 105mm L7 rifled gun, identical in caliber to the gun already familiar to Israeli crews from earlier Centurion and Patton variants, backed by a coaxial machine gun and additional machine guns for close defense against infantry, a deliberate choice reflecting Israel's frequent need to fight in built-up areas alongside conventional tank battles. Armor combined spaced steel plates with the front-mounted engine block itself, serving as supplementary protection, a configuration difficult to quantify in simple thickness figures given its layered, non-traditional arrangement, though independent analysts generally rated its frontal protection as comparable to or exceeding contemporary Western designs, despite the compromises the engine's forward placement required elsewhere in the hull's armor distribution. The engine, a Teledyne Continental Avdzes 1790 diesel, producing around 900 horsepower, gave the roughly 60-ton tank a range near 400 kilometers and a top speed of about 46 kilometers per hour, figures that reflected a deliberate trade-off of raw mobility and speed in exchange for the survivability-focused layout Tal had insisted upon. It solved the crew survivability problem that had haunted Israeli tank crews throughout 1973, giving them a genuine rear exit and a hull specifically designed to protect against exactly the kind of shaped charge anti-tank weapons that had proven so devastating in the previous war. But its heavier weight and front-engine configuration meant it was slower and less nimble than lighter contemporary Western designs, a trade-off Israeli doctrine accepted deliberately given how the tank's intended battlefield, dense and often urban terrain close to Israel's own borders, prioritized survivability over the kind of long-range maneuver warfare other nations' tanks were built to fight. A Merkava Mk.4 crew commander who trained on the tank in its first years of service recalled the psychological shift it represented. For the first time, we didn't dread being hit the way we had in the older tanks, because we knew there was actually a way out built into the design rather than an afterthought. Crews also noted a specific practical benefit of the rear access layout during resupply and casualty evacuation under fire, since ammunition and wounded crew could be moved through the rear door without exposing anyone to the same frontal arc where enemy fire was most likely to be concentrated. A logistical advantage that had not been a primary design goal but proved valuable in practice almost immediately. The Merkava Mk.4, introduced in 1983 following combat experience from Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon, refined the original design based on lessons from that campaign's urban and mountainous fighting. It retained the same 4-man crew and 105mm L7 gun as its predecessor, with improved spaced armor arrays and additional modular protection packages that could be added or adjusted depending on the specific threat environment a unit expected to face, alongside the same roughly 900 horsepower Teledyne Continental diesel engine, giving similar range and speed figures to the Mk.4. It solved specific vulnerabilities Israeli crews had identified during the 1982 fighting, particularly around mine protection for the belly of the hull, and improved defense against rocket-propelled grenades fired from close range in built-up areas, threats that had proven more common in Lebanon's terrain than the more conventional tank versus tank engagements the original Menk. One had been primarily designed around. A tank commander who fought in Lebanon during the 1982 campaign recalled the specific lesson that drove the mine protection improvements. We learned that in that terrain, the ground itself could kill you as easily as anything an enemy gunner aimed at you, and the original design hadn't accounted enough for that. That lesson, that Israeli tanks increasingly needed to survive not just conventional tank duels, but a much broader range of asymmetric threats, including mines, RPGs, and eventually guided missiles fired by irregular forces rather than only state militaries, set the trajectory for every subsequent Merkava revision. Israeli engineers responsible for the Mk.4's belly armor improvements reportedly studied mine damage patterns from actual 1982 casualties in detail, working backward from real injury and vehicle loss data rather than purely theoretical blast modeling, an approach that gave the resulting design changes an unusually direct grounding in documented battlefield experience rather than laboratory assumption alone. The Merkava Mk.4, entering service in 1989, addressed the firepower gap that had persisted since the original Mk.4, replacing the aging 105mm rifled gun with a 120mm MG251 smoothbore weapon, matching the caliber increasingly standard among NATO tanks by the late 1980s. It carried the same 4-man crew. The new 120mm gun, backed by coaxial and additional machine guns, further improved modular armor packages that continued the Mk.4's philosophy of adaptable, threat-specific protection, and a more powerful engine, a Teledyne Continental AVD 1790-9AR, diesel producing around 1,200 horsepower, giving the roughly 65-ton tank a range near 500 kilometers and a slightly improved top speed of about 55 kilometers per hour, despite the added weight of the new gun and armor. It solved the firepower deficiency that had left earlier Merkava variants undergunned compared to contemporary Western tanks, giving Israeli crews genuine parity in main gun performance while retaining the entire family's core survivability philosophy. But the tank's fundamental weight kept climbing with each successive revision, a trend Israeli engineers accepted as the necessary cost of adding both firepower and protection to a design already heavier than most Western contemporaries, by virtue of its front-engine layout. A gunner who transitioned from the Mark II to the Mark III recalled the improved confidence the new gun provided. Finally, we didn't have to close distance the way our fathers had in the Chariot. We could engage and kill at ranges that kept us safer to begin with. That final vehicle, the Merkava Mk.4, entered service in 2004 and stands as the definitive Israeli main battle tank of the 21st century. It carries the same four-man crew as every Merkava before it, its 120mm MG253 smoothbore gun, an evolution of the Mk. 3's weapon offering improved accuracy and compatibility with a wider range of modern ammunition types, backed by coaxial and roof-mounted machine guns for both tank and infantry threats. Armor combines further refined modular composite packages across the hull and turret with the continued front-engine protection philosophy inherited from the original mech. 1. Protection Israeli sources have kept largely classified, though widely regarded by independent analysts as among the most heavily protected tank designs in the world, against both conventional and asymmetric threats. The engine, a General Dynamics GD883 turbocharged diesel producing approximately 1,500 horsepower, gave the roughly 65-ton tank a range near 500 kilometers and a top speed of about 64 kilometers per hour, a genuine mobility improvement over earlier Merkava variants, despite the vehicle's continued emphasis on protection over raw speed. Later production Mk.4 vehicles also incorporated the Trophy Active Protection System, a radar-guided countermeasure capable of detecting and physically intercepting incoming anti-tank rockets and missiles before they reach the hull, adding an active defensive layer on top of the tank's passive and reactive armor that no earlier Merkava variant had possessed. Development of Trophy had actually begun years before the 2006 war, based on earlier experience with guided anti-tank missiles in Gaza and the West Bank. But the system's combat debut and full-scale fielding across the Merkava Mk.4 fleet accelerated substantially in the years immediately following the Wadi Saluki engagements, once the scale of the cornet threat had been demonstrated so directly. Inside the crew compartment, soldiers described conditions notably roomier than most contemporary tanks, specifically because of the rear access layout. One loader recalling that, "You never felt as trapped as stories from older tanks described, because you always knew the door out was right behind you, rather than somewhere you'd have to fight your way toward." The Merkava Mk.4's most demanding combat test came during the Second Lebanon War in the summer of 2006, when Israeli forces invaded southern Lebanon to confront Hezbollah forces equipped with substantial numbers of Russian-made Kornet anti-tank guided missiles, a weapon considerably more powerful than the Saga missiles that had devastated Israeli armor in 1973. During the Battle of Wadi Saluki in early August 2006, an Israeli armored column advancing through the valley came under sustained Kornet missile fire from concealed Hezbollah positions on the surrounding high ground, resulting in several Merkava Mk.4 tanks being struck and disabled, with a number of crew members killed and wounded despite the tank's design emphasis on survivability. That battle unfolded during one of the war's final major ground operations, as Israeli forces pushed toward the Litani River in the days before a United Nations brokered ceasefire took effect, terrain that gave Hezbollah fighters extended time to prepare concealed firing positions along the column's likely approach routes. A Merkava Mk.4 crew member who survived a Kornet strike during that battle described the moment vividly. "The missile hit, and the whole world became noise and smoke, but the hatch behind us still opened the way it was supposed to, and that door was the only reason any of us walked away from that tank." Israeli military investigations following the war concluded that while the Kornet's tandem warhead had proven capable of penetrating the Merkava Mk.4's armor under specific hit conditions, a genuine and sobering finding for a tank whose entire design philosophy centered on crew protection, the rear escape hatch, and general layout meant that even successful penetrating hits far more often resulted in surviving, evacuating crews than equivalent hits would have produced in tanks with more conventional layouts. A distinction Israeli commanders considered the war's most important tactical lesson regarding the vehicle. Institutional consequences followed within the Israeli defense establishment. The war's mixed armored performance, alongside broader criticism of overall military preparedness during the conflict, prompted the Winograd Commission's formal inquiry into the war's conduct and accelerated the Trophy Active Protection System's development timeline, fielding it years earlier than originally planned, specifically to counter the guided missile threat the Wadi Saluki fighting had demonstrated so starkly. The Winograd Commission's findings echoed, in some respects, the earlier Agranat Commission's conclusions from 1973, both identifying a pattern of institutional overconfidence and inadequate preparation for the specific threat actually encountered. A recurring theme in Israeli military self-assessment that speaks to the difficulty any institution faces in fully internalizing hard-won lessons across successive generations of officers and engineers. Assessed on its own terms, the Merkava Mk.4 represents the mature expression of a design philosophy unlike any other main battle tank in service, prioritizing crew survival through a combination of front engine placement, rear escape access, and increasingly sophisticated modular and active protection systems layered atop that original architectural choice. Its combat record in the 2006 war demonstrated both the philosophy's genuine value, since crew survival rates following penetrating hits remained notably better than historical experience with more conventionally designed tanks would predict, and its real limits, since determined, well-equipped irregular forces, armed with modern guided missiles, proved capable of disabling and even destroying the tank under the right conditions regardless of its unusual protective architecture. The Merkava's continued evolution since 2006, particularly the accelerated fielding of the Trophy Active Protection System, reflects an Israeli defense establishment willing to treat even a design built around Yom Kippur's hardest lessons as a starting point for continued adaptation, rather than a finished, permanent answer to the specific threats its crews would go on to face. Subsequent conflicts, including operations in Gaza, where Merkava tanks encountered a different mix of threats, ranging from anti-tank mines to close-range rocket-propelled grenades in dense urban terrain, continued to test and refine Israeli assumptions about which specific protective layers mattered most in which specific tactical context, an ongoing process of adaptation that the tank's modular design was specifically built to accommodate.